My name is Elena. I'm 80 years old now, and for 60 of those years I've carried a secret that burned hotter than the scars on my face. Today, sitting in this rocking chair that belonged to my mother, looking out the window at the garden I planted with these trembling hands, I've decided it's time to tell. Not for revenge, because that already had its moment, but because I realized that my silence protects the memory of a monster, and I won't die letting his story remain untouched. You see these marks on my face. Kind people look away when they meet me. Children get curious, but their parents discreetly pull them back. For decades, when someone asked, I lied. I said it was a domestic accident, a kitchen fire when I was young. But it wasn't an accident at all. It was the final act of cruelty by a man who used his power, his uniform, and his position to turn me into his personal property for 6 hellish months in 1964. His name was Colonel Viktor Sokolov. And before this conversation ends, you'll understand exactly who he was, what he did to me, and how I managed to completely destroy the brilliant career of one of the Soviet Army's most promising officers. But to understand the ending, I need to take you to the beginning. And the beginning isn't pretty. I need you to understand something before we continue. This isn't a story of immediate heroism. I wasn't brave from the first moment. I was scared, broken, humiliated. It took time to find strength. And when I found it, I used every ounce of it with surgical precision. But let's start from the real beginning, when I was just a 20-year-old girl who thought she understood how the world worked. It was 1964, and I lived in Leningrad, that magnificent city that today is called St. Petersburg again. My father had died 3 years earlier, working in the state's metallurgical factories. My mother got sick soon after. That kind of illness that Soviet doctors treated with neglect because you had no connections or money for bribes. I was the oldest of 3 siblings. Mikhail was 17 and worked as an electrician's apprentice. Natasha was only 14, still in school, dreaming of studying literature, a dream as distant from our reality as the moon. We lived in a kommunalka, you know what that is? A communal apartment where several families shared the same space. We had one tiny room for the 4 of us. We shared the kitchen with 6 other families, the bathroom with 4 more. You learn not to have privacy, not to have secrets. The walls were thin as paper, and everyone knew everyone's problems. But it also meant you had eyes watching, people who cared, a network of collective survival that kept many of us alive during those difficult years. I worked as a typist at the regional urban planning office. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was stable. And in the Soviet system, stability was worth gold. My salary kept food on the table, paid for my mother's expensive medicines that we got on the black market. I was careful, punctual, invisible. I learned early that young women who drew attention attracted the wrong kind of looks in a society where power was everything and the powerful did what they wanted. It was in March of that year that everything changed. The office received a routine inspection from the Ministry of Defense. Something about verifying the security of urban documents, ensuring there was no infiltration of capitalist elements in the city's development plans. At the time, it seemed like standard procedure. We had these inspections periodically. Officials would arrive, examine files, ask questions, and leave. Life went on. But this time, the one leading the inspection was Colonel Viktor Sokolov. He entered that office as if he owned not just the place, but all of us inside it. He was 42 years old. Uniform impeccably pressed, medals on his chest earned in operations that were never discussed openly. Gray hair at the temples that gave him a distinguished air. Blue eyes cold as the ice on the Neva River in winter. Tall, broad shoulders, that kind of presence that made people automatically straighten up and speak more quietly when he passed. In the first week he was professional. He asked his questions, examined documents, took notes in a small leather notebook he carried in his uniform's inner pocket. But I felt his eyes. Every woman knows that feeling, that sensation of being evaluated, measured, catalogued. It wasn't admiration. It was something more calculated, more predatory. Like a butcher evaluating a cut of meat that I end the second week, he started specifically requesting that I bring him the documents he needed. The young typist, he would tell my supervisor, she's efficient and understands the file organization. My supervisor, a 50-year-old man named Petrov who had always been kind to me, Had no choice but to obey. You didn't question a Soviet army colonel. You simply didn't do that. Not if you valued your position, your freedom, perhaps even your life. So I started spending more time in his presence. He asked questions about my family, my life. At first, they seemed like polite questions, the kind of superficial conversation you make to fill silence. But then I realized he was mapping my vulnerability. He discovered about my sick mother, about my younger siblings, about how I was the family's only breadwinner. Every piece of information I naively shared was a tool he stored to use against me later. At the end of the second week, he called me for a private meeting in an empty conference room. He said he had found irregularities in my work records, small inconsistencies that could indicate negligence or worse, intentional sabotage. My heart stopped. Sabotage was a serious accusation. People disappeared for less. Entire families were destroyed when someone was labeled an enemy of the state. He let the silence stretch out, watching my face pale, seeing fear grow in my eyes. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a smile that brought comfort. Of course, he said in a voice soft as poison velvet. These irregularities could simply be honest mistakes by a young woman overwhelmed with caring for a sick family. Perhaps all you need is someone who can guide you, protect your interests, ensure these small issues don't become bigger problems. I wasn't stupid. Even at 20, even scared, I understood perfectly what he was offering. Protection in exchange for what exactly? He still hadn't said explicitly, but the insinuation hung in the air like toxic smoke. I said I needed to think, that I appreciated his concern. He just nodded, those cold eyes never leaving my face. Think carefully, Elena Mikhailovna, he said using my patronymic formally, as if that made the whole situation more respectable. Think about your mother, your siblings. Think about how much you have to lose. I spent the weekend in mental agony. I told my closest neighbor in the Kommunalka, a 40-year-old woman named Vera, who had survived the siege of Leningrad during the war. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and Soviet pragmatism. Elena, she said, men like him always get what they want. The only question is how much you'll lose in the process. If you resist, he'll destroy you and your family anyway. If you give in, at least you can try to protect something. It was terrible advice but honest. And on Monday, when I returned to work, I discovered that Sokolov had extended his inspection for another 2 weeks. He was building his web meticulously, giving himself time, establishing his presence as permanent and inevitable. On Tuesday, my supervisor called me into his office. He was pale, sweating, avoiding my gaze. He said he had received direct orders from Colonel Sokolov to assign me as his personal assistant for the remainder of the inspection. This meant leaving my regular work and being available exclusively for his demands. Petrov knew what this meant. Everyone knew. But nobody was going to say anything, nobody was going to defend me. Fear was a more effective silencer than any official censorship. And that's how it officially began. Sokolov requisitioned a private temporary office in a nearby administrative building. He said he needed privacy to review sensitive documents. On the first afternoon I spent there, he locked the door and made his proposal explicit. He would be my protector, my patron. In return I would be. The term he used was attentive to his needs. When I hesitated, when I started to refuse, he pulled a folder from his briefcase. Inside were forged documents. Records showing I had deliberately altered urban planning data. That I had passed sensitive information to unauthorized contacts. All lies, but all perfectly documented with my forged signature, official stamps, witnesses he had certainly coerced or bought. If you refuse my generous offer, he said calmly, these documents will be sent to the KGB tomorrow morning. Your family will be on the streets by the end of the week. Your sick mother won't survive a winter without proper heating. And you? You'll spend the next 10 years in a Siberian labor camp, if you're lucky. Then he waited, and I understood I was completely trapped. There was nowhere to run, no one to ask for help. The entire system was designed to protect men like him and crush women like me. I cried there, in front of him, tears of desperation and humiliation. And he just smiled, as if my suffering was exactly the spice that made the situation more satisfying for him. Tomorrow, he said, you'll come to the apartment I've requisitioned. Here's the address. 8 o'clock in the evening. Don't be late. I won't describe in graphic detail what happened during those 6 months. Not because it's too late or because I'm concerned with decency, but because some things don't need to be said completely to be understood. Suffice it to say that he used me. Completely. Systematically. With a cruelty that went beyond the physical. He liked the power more than anything else. He liked seeing me arrive at the apartment he had requisitioned, a place in a building better than anything my family could dream of. He liked making me wait, sometimes for hours, knowing that each minute was psychological torture. He liked oscillating between false kindness and sudden cruelty, keeping me always off balance, never knowing which version of him would appear. There were rules. I should always be available when he called. I should smile when he wanted me to smile. I should pretend gratitude for the protection he was offering me. I should lie to my family about where I spent my nights, inventing stories about extra work, about a second job. My mother knew, of course. Mothers always know. I saw it in her eyes every time I came home in the early morning hours. But she said nothing, because what could she say? We were all trapped in the same snare. The worst part wasn't the physical abuse, as terrible as it was. The worst was what he did to my mind. He was intelligent, psychologically sadistic. He alternated between moments of extreme cruelty and moments of false kindness, creating a mental confusion that made me question my own perception of reality. Sometimes he gave me gifts, expensive food that I took to my family, better medicines for my mother. And then, in the next moment, he reminded me that all of this could disappear with a snap of his fingers. He isolated me socially. He made my work colleagues avoid me, spreading subtle rumors that I was his ambitious mistress, a woman who had seduced a married officer to gain privileges. Truth is always the first victim in these situations. People prefer to believe the version that makes them feel better about their own passivity. If I was a calculating bitch, they didn't need to feel guilty about not helping me. If I was a victim, then they had to confront their own cowardice. During those months, there were moments when I considered suicide. Moments when I looked at the Neva River and thought how easy it would be to simply walk into it and let the current carry everything away. But two things kept me alive. First, my family. If I died, they would have absolutely nothing. Second, and this grew slowly inside me like a seed planted in frozen soil waiting for spring, rage. A cold, calculated, patient rage. Everything came to a head in September of that year. Sokolov had been notified that he would receive an important promotion, possibly a post in Moscow, working directly for the upper echelons of the Ministry of Defense. It was the culmination of his career, the moment he had been preparing for years. And suddenly, I was no longer useful. Worse, I had become a risk. A woman who knew his secrets, who could make allegations, who could become an embarrassment precisely when he was ascending to circles where scandals were not tolerated. He never explicitly said he was planning to get rid of me permanently, but I could see in his eyes that he was calculating options. It was on a Thursday night. He was particularly cruel, more than usual, as if testing limits, seeing how far he could go. And then almost casually, he mentioned that he had heard my brother Mikhail was getting involved with questionable elements at work. It wasn't true, of course. Mikhail was a sweet, hard-working boy who didn't cause problems for anyone. But the threat was clear. It wasn't just about me anymore. He was letting me know he could reach my family at any time. Something broke inside me that night. Or perhaps it finally solidified. When I returned to his apartment 3 days later, I brought with me a small bottle I had obtained through black market contacts. Industrial acid, the kind used in factories. My plan was simple and desperate. I would wait for the right moment, when he was vulnerable, and destroy that face he thought was so distinguished, that face that opened doors and won favors. But I underestimated his paranoia. He found the bottle in my purse before I could act. He didn't yell, didn't get visibly angry. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, he smiled, that terrible smile I had learned to fear more than his rage. So, he said softly, my little Elena finally found courage. But courage without intelligence is just stupidity. What he did next was his final lesson, his final demonstration of absolute power. He held me down, and took that bottle, and poured the acid on my own face. I screamed until my throat was raw, But the apartment was in a building where nobody asked questions, where nobody got involved. The pain was indescribable, as if my face was burning from the inside out, layer by layer. Eventually I passed out, and when I woke up I was in a hospital, being questioned by doctors who clearly didn't believe the story Sokolov had fabricated about a domestic accident. But it didn't matter if they believed. What mattered was that a Soviet army colonel had provided an official explanation, and questioning that would be questioning the very structure of authority that kept the system functioning. So they treated my wounds, gave me sedatives, and sent me home with scars I'll carry to the grave. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, then another month recovering at home. My mother took care of me, changing bandages, feeding me when the pain was too much for me to eat alone. She never said, "I told you so," or blamed me. She just cared for me with that silent resignation that so many Soviet women had perfected, accepting tragedy as an inevitable part of life. But something was different in me. The physical pain eventually subsided, but it left behind a crystalline clarity that didn't exist before. Sokolov had made a mistake. A monumental mistake. He had left me alive. Worse, he had left me alive with physical proof of his cruelty permanently etched on my face. And while he thought this would make me useless as a witness, because after all, who would believe a disfigured woman against a decorated colonel, he didn't count on one thing: my absolute lack of anything left to lose. When I recovered enough to walk, I began my work. First, I went to the archives of the office where I had worked, now that I was no longer an employee but still had contacts. With the help of Petrov, my former supervisor who was consumed with guilt for not having protected me, I got copies of all the documents Sokolov had reviewed during his inspection. I found patterns of unauthorized alterations, forged signatures not just mine but of other employees too, evidence that he had been systematically fabricating irregularities, probably to have blackmail material on multiple people. Then I went deeper. I talked to other women discreetly, carefully, and I discovered I wasn't the first. Sokolov had a pattern. In every city where he had served, there were young women who had disappeared from their lives, who had abruptly changed jobs, who carried invisible scars. Some spoke to me, seeing in my visible scars a reflection of their own hidden wounds. Others were too afraid, and I didn't blame them. The question was how to use this information. Going to the police was useless. Going to the KGB was suicide. They would protect one of their own. But Sokolov had enemies, as all ambitious men have. He had people who envied his meteoric rise, who questioned how he had gotten his promotions so quickly, who suspected that not all his decorations were deserved. It was Vera, my wise neighbor, who gave me the final key. Powerful men don't fall because of their victims, she said. They fall because of other powerful men who see an opportunity. She told me about Major Volkov, an officer who had been passed over for a promotion that went to Sokolov years ago, and who since then had been accumulating resentment. And she told me about Sokolov's wife, Nina Sokolova, a woman from an influential family, whose father was a retired general with extensive connections in the party. It took 3 months to assemble everything perfectly. 3 months of meticulous, careful work, where a single mistake could not only ruin everything but probably kill me. But I had something Sokolov never had. Nothing to lose and everything to gain. First, I approached Major Volkov. Not directly, that would be too suspicious. Through an intermediary, a former work colleague whose brother served under Volkov's command. I let documents fall into his hands. Documents showing how Sokolov had manipulated inspection reports, how he had inflated his own achievements while subtly sabotaging the work of rivals. For a man like Volkov, this was pure gold, but he was too cautious to act based on that alone. Then I went to Nina Sokolova. This was riskier. I arranged a meeting through her lady's companion, saying I had information about her family's security. When we met at a discreet cafe, she saw me, saw my destroyed face, and something in her eyes changed. She knew. Maybe not the details, but she knew the kind of man she had married. I told her everything. I didn't spare details, didn't try to soften the truth. I showed her documents, letters he had forced me to write, records of bribe payments he had made using funds that technically belonged to the military budget. And then I delivered the final blow. Information I had bought from a source in the military medical department about 3 other women in previous cities, one of whom had completely disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Nina Sokolova was a woman of the Soviet aristocracy, raised to understand power and politics. She didn't cry, didn't have an emotional breakdown. She simply looked at the documents, then at me and said, "My father needs to see this." And that was the phrase that sealed Viktor Sokolov's fate. General Mikhailov, Sokolov's father-in-law, was an old guard man, a war veteran with an antiquated code of honor that still meant something, even in the cynical Soviet system. For him, the idea that his son-in-law had tarnished the uniform he so respected, that he had used military power to abuse civilians, that he had forged official documents for personal gain, was an unforgivable betrayal. He launched a silent internal investigation, and with the help of Major Volkov, who now saw an opportunity to finally surpass his rival, and with my detailed testimony supported by documentation I had meticulously collected, the net began to close around Sokolov. Viktor Sokolov's fall wasn't quick or dramatic. There was no public arrest, no spectacular trial. That's not how it worked in the Soviet system. Instead, he simply began to disappear. First, the promotion to Moscow was postponed indefinitely. Then, he was transferred to a minor administrative post in a provincial city in the Far East. His medals were reviewed, and some were quietly revoked. His reports were re-examined and his achievements were diminished or attributed to others. He was systematically erased from the success narrative he had so carefully built. Nina filed for divorce and with her father's support, obtained it easily. The property he had accumulated was divided, his social connections evaporated. His name became toxic in circles where it was once celebrated. I heard he tried to resist, that he made threats, that he tried to use his old connections. But he discovered that the moment you fall from grace in the Soviet system, those connections dissolve like snow in spring. He died in 1982, 18 years later, a forgotten man in a forgotten city, having served the rest of his military career in complete obscurity. No honors, no ceremony, no one but a few reluctant colleagues at his funeral. His death was noted in a small two-line mention in an internal military newspaper. Nothing more. As for me, I eventually rebuilt a life. It wasn't the life I would have had if I had never crossed paths with Viktor Sokolov, but it was mine. I married late, at 35, to a good man who saw beyond the scars. We had 2 children. I worked in libraries, a quiet job where my scars gradually became just part of who I was. My mother lived to meet her grandchildren before dying peacefully in 1973. Mikhail became a respected electrical engineer. Natasha fulfilled her dream and became a literature teacher. And throughout all those years, I carried the story. Sometimes the story seemed to weigh more than the original trauma. But now at 80 years old, sitting here telling you, I feel the weight finally diminishing. Not through forgiveness, because I don't forgive and never will, but because finally the truth has been told completely, without filters, without softening. Viktor Sokolov thought he could use his power to destroy me completely, and he almost succeeded. But he forgot that a person who has been taken to the bottom, to the point where there's nothing left to lose, becomes the most dangerous person in the world. Because we no longer have fear. We only have purpose. This is my story. These are my scars, visible and invisible. And this is my testimony that no monster is untouchable when his victims finally find their voice. If Elena's story touched your heart, if you believe that stories of survival and justice need to be heard, please like this video. Your interaction helps spread this message to more people who need to know that even in the darkest moments, the strength to fight still exists within us. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more true stories of courage, survival, and justice. People like Elena deserve to have their voices echo around the world. And tell me in the comments, do you know any stories of overcoming adversity that need to be told? Share them with me. Let's create a chain of voices that refuse to remain silent.